He was the person who basically had the idea for a one-world government. He wanted to start a United Nations. And he had all these great ideas, you know, one-world government, all this kind of stuff, New World Order. And God had other ideas. And God came down and he cast confusion and changed the languages of the people. So they went and scattered abroad on the earth. That basically tells us what God thinks about the United Nations. Amen? So anyway, this caused the conspiracy to go underground. And for centuries it existed in various forms. And if you look in the books, the literature of Masonry, you will find that Masonry says it is the direct linear descendant from the ancient mystery religions, from the ancient fertility cults. Now what does that mean? That sounds sort of exciting and mysterious and exotic. Well, the ancient fertility cults were cults that revolved around human and animal reproduction. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's what they mean. It's Baal worship, essentially. If you study the worship of Baal in the Bible, you've got all these false gods like Molech and Baal and Chemosh and some of these others. All of them, their rites involve sexuality. And that's the same thing that Masonry is. That's why the god of Masonry is the phallus. That's why you have Masonic monuments like the Washington Monument that look like a giant phallic symbol. It's that simple. So this is the conspiracy. And it may have been called many names, like, for example, before the time of Christ, Masonry was called the Dionysian Artificers. Later on, it was called the Gnostics, and we'll look at this more in detail in a couple of minutes. But I just want you to realize that even though it was called many things, just like the church, down through the centuries, the church, the true church of Jesus Christ, had many different names. But it was the same basic thing. Well, it's the same thing with the devil's church, if you will. Now, people get on me about this, you know, and I get frustrated, I think, because they tell me, well, there's no such thing as a conspiracy. I get this from Christians all the time, and I feel like, you know, knocking on their heads and asking if there's anybody home up there. Amen? You know, they say, oh, this is all nonsense. There's no conspiracy. The Bible doesn't say anything about a conspiracy. I mean, excuse me? You know, I mean, for example, just turn to the 2nd Psalm. It says in the 1st verse, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Now that's a conspiracy. Not only that, Jesus Christ himself discussed this very same thing. And it's important to understand that the key thing of the conspiracy is that it's done in secret. That's the essence of a conspiracy. Jesus Christ says in John 18, I believe it is, in secret have I done nothing. He taught everything openly. Christianity has no secrets. If you want to find out about what's so great about Christianity, we're delighted to tell you. We don't make you go through a bunch of dumb rituals and stand on your head or wear a blindfold or spit nickels while sitting in lotus position or anything like that. I mean, we're just delighted to share what Jesus Christ has done for us. Our lives are an open book. Our Bible is an open book. You know, there's no secrets. But in the Masons and in all these other occult fraternities, it's all secretive. Now, Jesus himself addressed this. And he addressed it using a powerful metaphor which runs like a web of evil through the entire Bible. And if you go to Matthew chapter 16, you'll find that Jesus says something very important. He says, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, he's talking about leaven. What does that mean? Well, happily, we can look at other parts of the same chapter and Jesus defines it. In the same chapter in verse 12, it says that he was speaking of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So leaven is bad doctrine, because we know both the Pharisees and the Sadducees were off into doctrinal error. The Sadducees were a lot like today's liberals. They denied the resurrection, they denied the existence of the supernatural realm, they denied the spirit world, and so on. And of course, we all know who the Pharisees were. Paul elaborated on this symbolism further. He said in 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8, your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Now that's the key point to the conspiracy. Because if any of you have made bread, how much leaven, which is just yeast, does it take to make bread? Not very much, just a little bit. I mean, if you put too much in, you're going to have something that looks like the monster that devoured Cleveland sitting there on your countertop. You just take a little bit, And then you work the dough, and you work the dough, and what happens? The leaven disappears. It just sort of blends into the dough, and you can't even tell where it went. But it starts percolating through the entire mass of dough until all of a sudden you've got the whole thing leavened. And that's how this works in the church. That's how the conspiracy works in society in general. If you've got one Mason in your congregation, and especially if he's like a deacon or somewhere else in leadership, you're going to end up with a kind of one bad apple spoiling the whole barrel routine. That's percolating down, and you're going to have all sorts of issues within your local body. Similarly, if you have a Mason in your family, his spiritual authority is going to percolate down and leaven the lives of the wife, of the children, of the grandchildren, of the great-grandchildren, down 3 or 4 generations, and that's a curse that needs to be broken. Leaven, like yeast, is a living organism which is capable of reproducing itself, and that's what happens. You never just have one of these dudes in a church. They always start recruiting, because Masons are like homosexuals. They can't reproduce themselves naturally. They can only, yeah, amen, they can only recruit. You know, think of that. That's the way with every cult. See, we are born again. Just like a baby is born out of the womb of its mother, we are born again. No other religion, no other cult can do that. Most especially the Masons. And so they have to recruit. Just like homosexuals are barren, they cannot reproduce themselves naturally, so they have to recruit. That's why you've got the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on your door, is because they're trying to recruit. They're not trying to do evangelism. They're not trying to win souls, because if they tried to win a soul, they'd be like a dog that chased a car and caught one. They wouldn't know what to do with it, amen? So this is the problem. They can't reproduce themselves, and so they do it in other ways. Now, the key element here to understand is the fact that Jesus, in another chapter, talks about the conspiracy of leaven in a very, very specific way. Now, I find this very interesting. I know what people are going to say when I talk about this. Oh, the chapter and verse numbers in the Bible aren't inspired and blah, 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 blah. But this is interesting. If you go to Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. Now, think about it. Here you've got the 13th chapter of Matthew, and of course 13 is the number that's associated with witch covens and with the devil and all this kind of thing. And then you've got the number 33, like the 33rd degree Mason. Interesting coincidence. This chapter is the chapter where Jesus does all these fantastic parables about the kingdom. And in there he says, the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. Now, this is kind of a mysterious passage. And I'll tell you, if you talk to 3 or 4 different pastors, you're going to get 3 or 4 different exegeses of this passage. And I'm going to try and share with you what mine is, and I trust that it's going to be adequate to the purposes. What we've got here is, first of all, we need to identify the woman. It says a woman did this. Now, who is this woman? Well, some people say that this is the church, but I don't think that's correct. Because, first of all, nowhere in the rest of the Bible do you find a woman identified as a church, symbolically. The church is called the bride, the church is called the Lamb's wife, but the church is never called just a woman. So that's one reason. There are other ways in which the woman term is used symbolically and prophetically, and that's what we're doing here tonight. We're looking at prophecy. So, prophetically speaking, a woman is used in a positive way as a symbol of Israel. For example, you have the woman in, let's see, Isaiah 54:6, Jeremiah 6:2, or Revelation 12:1. These are good women. I have likened Israel to a comely and delicate woman. This is Israel in a righteous state. But there's also Israel in a backslidden state, and this is also symbolized by a woman. For example, in Lamentations 1:17, Ezekiel 16:30, or Hosea 3:1, where, for example, we have the prostitute Gomer as a symbol of backslidden Israel. Then finally, we have the famous woman, probably the most famous wicked woman in the Bible, which is the mystery Babylon in Revelation 17, the woman who is riding the beast. So it doesn't seem to me as though there's any prophetic justification for this woman being, in fact, the church. Now, What about the meal? Well, what is meal? Meal is ground up wheat, okay? What is wheat, symbolically? Well, happily, Jesus tells us that in this very chapter. He says, wheat is the children of the kingdom. See verses 25 through 30 and verse 38 of chapter 13. So we are the children of the kingdom. What's this ground up business? Well, think about it. How many of you ever seen actual wheat berries right off the branch, right off the stalk? I mean, they're like, kind of like tiny popcorn. You can't eat them. You can put them in a jar of water and soak them and get them to sprout, or you can grind them up and make flour, but you just can't eat wheat berries. They're utterly useless. And that's how we are. When we get born again, that we're not much use to Jesus. We have to be ground up and broken and made suitable to the Master's service. Amen? That is the key here. So we are talking about the children of the kingdom. Now what does it say? It says that this is divided up into 3 measures of meal, and then the leaven is put in each measure. So we got a division. Now if you look back at the history of Christendom, basically you've got 3 major divisions of Christianity. You've got the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, and the Protestant church. Pretty clear. Now if you think about it, the Roman Catholic Church has a lot of leaven in it, obviously. I mean, they've got idols, they've got doctrinal problems, they've got all sorts of weirdness going on, purgatory, rosaries, things like that. Unfortunately, the Orthodox Church is not much better. They've got a little improvement, but not much. But then we've got the third one, the Protestant. What is the leaven in the Protestant churches? Well, I think we're going to find very readily that the leaven there is Freemasonry, in point of fact. Let's look at this. Down through the years, there's been a fundamental symbol that is part of the occult. It's part of Freemasonry. And it's from a philosophy called the Kabbalah. Now, what, you may ask, is the Kabbalah? Well, it's an occult system of Jewish mysticism and magic that dates back to just before the time of Christ, in the intertestamental period, between the time that Malachi wrote his book and the time that John the Baptist began his ministry. Now, the Kabbalah, we are told, is the philosophical core of Freemasonry. It is the ground philosophy behind Freemasonry. And this is its most central and its most important symbol. You will notice here we've got 3 pillars. The pillar of severity, the pillar of equilibrium, and the pillar of mercy. Now, the pillar of severity in Hebrew is called the Ima pillar. The pillar of mercy is called the Abba pillar. Now, you all probably know what Abba means in Hebrew. It means father. But Ima means mother. So this is the mother pillar and the father pillar. Now, this symbol is very rich in its many, many layers of meaning. I could spend a whole evening just talking about all the different ways in which it is interpreted. But for now, we're going to look at it chronologically as a kind of a game plan for Satan's work down through the centuries. And we see here, for example, the pillar of mercy, the father pillar. What did Jesus call the Judaism of his day? He called it the traditions of the fathers. We today, even Bible scholars, in both Judaism and Christianity, will talk about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a patriarchal tradition. And so what we have here, this is the father or the patriarchal pillar. It represents apostate Judaism, because we all understand that when the Jews ultimately turned their back on the message of Christ, in Acts 7, when they stoned Stephen, what that ended up with is the light spiritually went out of Israel as a nation, and Jews had to start getting saved the same way Gentiles did, one at a time.